Hello, I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar. Welcome to Superhero University on Wonder Woman Rebirth, Year 1, Session Number 2, Merciful Minerva. Have a seat. Class is now in session. Before we got started, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. I had a minor audio problem where every now and then my microphone would crackle. I believe I've chased down the problem, but it was impossible to remove from the audio of this session. It doesn't happen very often, but I wanted you to know that I'm aware of the problem and that it's not on your end, it's on mine, and I believe I've got it sorted out for the next one. Also, when you get near the end of the session, you'll hear that there was some confusion about which issue to read next because I was working from the individual issues, while most of my listeners are probably working from the collected trade paperback. If you've got time before you listen, go read the interlude about Dr. Barbara Ann Minerva before you listen to this session of the seminar. Sorry for that confusion, but let's join that session already in progress. Greetings and welcome to the second session of the Superhero University seminar series on Wonder Woman Rebirth, Year 1. Really great conversation the first time around, or I should say, a really great conversation has rolled out of the first session, and it's some of that stuff that I would like to talk about. One thing that became apparent to me as I listened in on the conversation, mostly going on in the chat for my patrons, most of that conversation led me to understand that I was going to have to talk a little bit about the superhero comics industry. I will try and keep this on point and not super boring, but it is impactful on the way that this story is being told. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes. Again, both of these came from the patron Discord chat, and I will quote Susie and Kate Met, respectively. Susie said, "I am willing to see how the relationship between Steve and Diana plays out in the rest of the book, but I can tell you, I'm not too invested." And then Kate said, "So far, Steve has been shown to be a third wheel, maybe a good shot, and probably a good friend? Is that all the lady needs?" she asks, meaning Diana. "A guy who's good at violence and friendship and available?" Kate also said, "If they're trying to bring in new readers, it seems like they'd have handed it to a new reader and see if it makes sense. Or, a woman." I cannot agree with these things more. And there is I shudder to say a good reason, because it's not a good reason, but there is a reason that is understandable as to why these kinds of things would happen. I mentioned in the chat that I feel like there is, especially in terms of Steve Trevor, a massive resting on previous continuity that technically should not be taken into account anymore. For a little history, Steve Trevor has almost always been important in Diana's backstory and is almost always the romantic interest, even when this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That is 76 years of nearly uninterrupted publication, plus a popular television show. That is a lot of sort of pop cultural weight to be brought to bear on that character. So I mentioned in the first session that the picking and choosing of what's important and what's not important and what are you going to emphasize and what are you going to de-emphasize or recontextualize, I feel like Steve is a big part of that conversation in this new Year 1. To a certain extent, the person who's writing this book has to ask himself, so if the majority of all of us know who Steve is, and that Diana is to some extent going to end up with Steve, then why waste the time making Steve compelling? I mean, when I put it like that, it's a little bit of a ridiculous question because we all know the answer. I mean, for step 1, so he can become an actual character. Step 2, so we understand why Diana finds him compelling. Step 3, because it's just all around better storytelling. I mean, I think we all see the answer to that question, but at the same time, when you have 22 pages, somewhere between 22 and 25 pages of comic book to tell your story, you have to pick and choose what things are going to go in. Any single page is a massive amount of real estate. And in this case, it seems like Mr. Rucka decided to spend time on Steve, but not necessarily time on Steve making him really unique or letting us get to know him in the way that we get to know Diana a little bit. Part of the reason that he could come to this choice is because superhero comics have a confusing relationship with relaunches and new readers. New readers are vital to keep the company alive, to keep the publishing line alive, to keep the medium alive. But complicated interwoven continuities have become a major selling point to existing readers. There is a certain amount of nerd cred, or you must know this much backstory in order to ride this ride kind of thing going on. And new readers have a really hard time grokking that selling point. You show up, you want to know what's going on from the get-go. You don't want to necessarily have a character show up who was important 25 years ago, and you're just supposed to know that story or that weight or whatever it is that makes that character important. You don't want to have to recognize that just from this latest appearance. At the same time, the old reader doesn't want somebody to have to take a step back and explain every single thing about this character that they want to use right now. And I'm telling you, I cannot overestimate how important that interwoven complex continuity thing is to existing readers. To someone of my age, when comic books used to be very difficult to come by, I mean, I mentioned the grocery store spinner rack, which makes it very easy for you to find comic books as a whole, but it's nearly impossible to use a grocery store spinning rack or your convenience store spinner rack to follow the books, right? You need a subscription or you need a local comic book shop in order to do that. And so when comic books were difficult to come by, when it was difficult to have read every single previous issue, and let me tell you what, hunting for back issues was a whole other thing. And that's why caption boxes used to have an asterisk, like they would mention, the character would mention an important plot point that was going on right now, and there'd be an asterisk next to it, and you'd go down to a caption box, and the editor would tell you what issue the thing they're talking about happened. So that in theory, if you found that issue, you would get more depth. And that was great. I appreciated that effort on their behalf, but it was still difficult to find those issues. So when that was harder, the ability to have an encyclopedic knowledge of a superhero or team's continuity was, well, I mean, I was a big geek. I was a big nerd about it. But at the same time, it gave me that nerd cred. When somebody didn't understand something that was going on in a current story, they would come and ask me because I probably knew. Partly because I took advantage of my mother's long shopping trips and read everything on the spinner rack. And partly because I have a really good memory and I would just file it away. So I cannot overstress how important the continuity angle is for existing readers. I mean, I think you see it a little bit in the MCU, right? It's just easier to go watch the previous movies. I also can't overestimate how much that is a hurdle to new readers. How many of you are listening to this seminar because you didn't know where to start with Wonder Woman, right? And she had an origin last year, and it's still daunting to walk into the comic shop. So any relaunch is, in theory, meant to simplify for new readers so that they can bring them into the fold. But it can't be too simple, or it alienates the existing core fan base. Kate mentions that they spend 2 whole pages per issue for pure art. They have time for story. Now, I'm going to say to you, I agree. I agree completely. Not necessarily for the 2 whole pages just for art, because that's part of the joy of comic books. But at the same time, there's a way to use art in comic books that will get across detail, the beauty of the art, and also further convey the story. So when we get to the Batman book, we are going to go through that thing page by page, which is not a thing I have to do in this Wonder Woman story. Some of those pages we go panel by panel, honestly. And it's necessary because the art is doing so much at the same time that characters in the foreground are having conversations. It's doing all of the thing. And that's not being done here. So I'm not going to argue against art for art's sake in superhero comics, but I am going to argue that you need to be aware that it has a job to do. And it's also interesting that you bring that up in particular for these next two issues, because I mentioned in the Discord chat that I was pretty snarky about them, and a big chunk of why I'm snarky about them is how much real estate is burnt in favor of art versus getting more story across. We're going to talk a lot about wasted space this session. That is going to happen, because there's kind of a lot of it. Going back to the superhero industry problem. At their heart, superhero comics are very mired in the past. You can tell this by looking. They are mainly characters that are straight white men. They are still mainly written by straight white men. And you're dealing with characters in universes that are very old and have never really received the thorough house cleaning that they kind of needed. You might remember from the first session that I used the term soft reboot, where we make the characters a little younger, or we make it clear that we are going to ignore some parts of the continuity, but we're not sure which parts yet. That's what I mean by a not thorough enough house cleaning. A lot of these universes could stand to be completely stopped and restarted, but again, you have that very difficult tension between the existing reader and the new reader. And let's be honest, new readers want diversity. Some of the best-selling books and moves by comics right now are Ms. Marvel. A lot of these are Marvel examples because DC is not doing as well at some of these things right now. But we can say at DC, you've got Batgirl of Burnside, where she's in college. It's still Barbara Gordon, but she's in college and kind of dealing with, for lack of a better term, millennial things while also being Batgirl. That got a lot of press when it started because she got a really great costume redesign. There was a Black Canary book where she was traveling with her rock band, but she was the front woman, and that was very popular. Over at Marvel, you've got Ms. Marvel, you've got Squirrel Girl, you've got Jane as Thor, you have the Mockingbird book that was very popular. And I mentioned Jane Foster became Thor. They stopped, I guess Thor Odinson didn't go away. He just stopped being the main character of the Thor book, and Jane picked up his hammer because she was worthy and became the new Thor. You also have Sam Wilson picking up Captain America's shield and becoming the new Captain America, and that's the guy who was the Falcon, right? And he's African American. And then you have the Wonder Woman movie itself. Like, that thing, it's still, this week, is setting records. If I remember correctly, it's now the highest domestic grossing DCEU movie. There is definitely an argument that new readers want that diversity. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, the bulk of old readers are often put off by diversity. There is some overt racism and sexism mixed into that. If I'm honest, there's a lot of overt racism and sexism present in this statement. But again, some of them just have that commitment to the continuity, and that is a huge part of their identity as comic book nerds. And they're not as interested in a situation where it's easier for a new reader to come in. They're just not. But again, so you have a lot of commitment to continuity as a selling point. That is a big deal of it. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. I mentioned I am of a certain age, and my ability to remember obscure details of continuity is still something of a point of pride for me, even as it gets in the way of me enjoying reading a lot of new books. I can hold both of those things in my head at the same time. It's really complicated. Also, your broflakes are some who just claim it's change for change's sake, which could really be either of the other two reasons in new clothes, right? That could just be overt racism and sexism wrapped in velvet, be a little bit softer. Or it could be we don't really care about new people, we just want everybody to be impressed by our nerd knowledge. Now, this makes reboots and origins particularly complicated. For instance, I've mentioned the good bits of reinterpretation and updating, but the bad bits are things like what we see with Steve. The writer seems to be relying on knowledge that the hopeful new audience doesn't have. Now, they're admittedly theoretical. We don't know that there is a new audience there, but the company is hopeful that there will be a new audience there, and they still don't make it easy on them. This can leave this story lacking details and characterization that I think we all agree would enrich it massively, right? Like, we're going to talk more about Steve and just wonder why we're supposed to care. And it's because not a lot of work was done on the upfront. To start talking about these two new books, we're going to talk about something else from cleaning up after last seminar. But in these books specifically, I'm really confused by this. because these books feel really slow to me. These chapters feel really slow to me. Superheroes are action stories, and simply put, in the first 4 issues, not enough happens. There can be all kinds of internal and emotional conflict, but at the end of the day, we need to externalize that into something that the brightly garbed person with powers can punch. This is well evidenced in the movie, actually, by Steve's mission bringing the Germans with him to Themyscira. He literally, although accidentally, brings the Great War to the shores of Themyscira. There were immediately guys to punch or shoot arrows in or hit with swords. That gave impetus to the whole story. It's the same for No Man's Land. It's the same for Ares. We can't punch war, but we can punch the god of war. This is a huge thing for superhero stories. Whatever is going on inside the hero needs to be externalized into somebody who is probably a supervillain, or at the very least, a bunch of dudes robbing a bank. You can look at Spider-Man as a really great example of this. A lot of times in early Spider-Man stuff, you had a tension in Peter Parker. What's the greater good, right? We all know that with great power comes great responsibility, but what's his greatest responsibility? Is it to save lives as Spider-Man, or is it to take care of his aging Aunt May? And this is why so many of those stories come down to him doing something like holding the heart pills that Aunt May needs in his hand, that he knows she's across town and needs desperately, while at the same time, the Scorpion is over there robbing a bank and putting people's lives in danger. And so now he has to decide, what's my greatest responsibility? Is it as Spider-Man or is it as Peter Parker? We take that internal thing and we externalize it into stuff that might require punching. This is really important, not for comics, but for superheroes. Comics can be about anything, but for superheroes, we need somebody to punch. Talking about these couple of issues, how much time does Diana spend sitting in a cell? How much time does Steve spend visiting a goddaughter we don't care about? How much space do we waste with people not understanding Diana's language? How many times must Steve be debriefed? And if the answer is we could have spent a lot less time on these things, then there's definitely room for us to make Steve more interesting and compelling. I'm going to talk a lot more about some of that as how it impacts the plot when we get to the end after talking about the beat by beat. But yeah, that was definitely a conversation that came up, and I felt I needed to explain some of what's going on in the comic book industry in order to make it make any kind of sense. So there was also some discussion about how what I felt was a very slut-shaming panel for Princess Diana wasn't meant to come across that way, but some other people read it differently. The inimitable Susie said, "I read it as more whiny from the Amazon on the right. More like Diana's been with her, but not me. She obviously wants to be with Diana. It comes off as desperate in a way that I feel kind of bad for that woman. I don't read her comments as negative about Diana. It would be better if we saw more about relationships between the Amazons, but it doesn't jump out to me as shaming. It's probably all in how I'm reading it and how I'm presuming things work on Themyscira." This is an interesting point because it's very different from the way that I read it. I mentioned that my own reading might be colored by my particularly masculine background. I also again realize how loaded the term locker room talk is at this stage in our nation, but keeping locker room talk in mind, it's difficult to hear a group of people talk about somebody else's promiscuity or lack thereof and not read it as a shaming technique. But, like I said, I'm prepared to own that as being part of me being a dude who grew up around a bunch of dudes. Okay? And honestly, I like Susie's reading a lot better. I just wish that the text supported it for me. For instance, I agree that I'd like to see more of Amazon life. That could have helped. If we would have more of an idea of what relationships on the island are like, then we might have a better idea of what that Amazon means when she says those things about Diana. Or if we had a clearer understanding of what that page was doing. I spent a lot of time on talking about how it contrasted and compared Diana and Steve, and that I still don't entirely know what its job was. And that's kind of problematic, because if I don't know what's going on the page, then it makes that one panel confusing. It was also talked about in the chat that it leaves the Amazon seeming kind of catty and desperate, which we also talked about being an odd choice for what's supposed to be an island of empowered women. To that, I want to quote Susie again. "I agree, Ray catty and desperate. It's not the best way to depict these two women in light of how women are treated in our media. But I just didn't think it was slut-shaming. Diana is being celebrated. I get what they were going for, but I see how it could miss the mark in depicting how individuals in a promiscuous society would act. I don't have a problem with the desperation if I'm thinking about how their society functions, not our own. That is a great example about a promiscuous society. There is a lot of interesting world building just in the phrase promiscuous society. And in fact, it may be worth taking this into the next session and having some more conversation about this. But I'd like to hear from Susie what she means by a promiscuous society. I think maybe they're just not hung up on sex. Maybe a lot of people are able to have sex with multiple partners without getting possessive, which kind of makes sense if the Amazons are immortal. There's a limited population on the island, right? Everybody is going to be interested in everybody else at some point. I know that's kind of ridiculous to say, but you get what I mean. Like if you have, we're never really given a population count, but let's generously say there are 1,000 Amazons, but they've been here for 3,000 years, maybe. Again, we're not for sure on their immortality or how exactly it works or when it started, and some of that comes up in these next issues. So I'm making some assumptions. But if you have a society of 1,000 women and you have 3,000 years to be together, it does seem likely that a great number of them are going to be interested in a great number of other of them, and that those interest levels are going to shift and change over time. I'm not even talking about an attack on monogamy per se, but I think we can look at our own society and see how difficult it is for two people to maintain relationships that go on over decades. Now imagine that that's two people trying to maintain a relationship over millennia. That's got to be very difficult. I want to talk about what a promiscuous society is more, but that's kind of what I imagine. It is like we need to stop being hung up on sex and monogamy and who's with who, because that's not a thing that we can expect to stay static when we all live forever with this relatively small population. And I think that world building, that potential interesting world building, absolutely could have been put in place instead of things like Steve visiting a goddaughter we don't care about, or people misunderstanding Diana's language, or Steve being debriefed, or, if I'm honest, literally all of Minerva's backstory, which took up an entire issue. And I liked that issue a lot, you guys. But if it comes down to, do I get Minerva's backstory, or do I find out the Amazon backstory, I will pick the Amazon backstory 100% of the time. Susie says she means multiple partners, probably all at once. Let's say polyamory, as far as I understand it. That's not my lifestyle, so I don't want to speak for people, but as I generally understand it, you might be talking about kind of a polyamorous lifestyle rather than even serial monogamy. That's really interesting. It's especially interesting because William Moulton Marston, the creator of Wonder Woman, was himself in a polyamorous relationship for decades. I'm going to put a pin in that because we're going to talk a lot about him, I think, probably when we go back and look at the original origin story at some point. Because he's a fascinating individual with a lot of interesting stuff going on in his life. And so the idea that all of Themyscira might be pretty polyamorous most of the time is interesting. Yeah, that's another way to take a look at it. Either a series of shifting serial monogamies, or a large polyamory, or more likely, because people are complicated, some combination of the two, right? Hippolyta and Philippus look like they are together, the two of them, a lot. And it doesn't mean that they don't have other partners additionally at different times, but we do see them together romantically a lot and saying, my love, and using pet names for each other. So it depends on who you're with and when you're with them and all that kind of stuff, which again is so much more interesting. And something that I would like to see on the page, right? All right, let's take a look at the beat-by-beat breakdown on these two issues. And let's be honest, these two issues do not hang together as well as the first two, or to be honest, the last two. But we're going to lump them together anyway as best we can, and they do make something of a sense connected together. Broadly, I would say that Diana is introduced to the world, and then Dr. Minerva, and then the readers are introduced to Dr. Minerva. That's how they hang together. That's all I got. We start out on the very first page with Diana and Steve sort of having a meet cute in the cockpit of the invisible plane, And I think that's kind of weird because they've already met. And also they've ostensibly been in this cockpit together for probably several hours. It seems like those are weird facts to keep in my head at the same time that they're having a romantic comedy meet cute. I will say I like the inside of the plane, knowing where it's going and being all super sciencey. I like that a lot. But again, I have been clear about my preferences for Amazons and technology. But I basically hate the rest of it. I really do. I think it's silly and not cute in the way that it wants to be. And also takes up a lot of space that we could have put towards more useful story bits. Then we have a whole page of the plane landing / crashing. I'm not exactly sure which one it's doing. And most of that entire page is so that we can see that an eagle is watching. Now that's going to be important as we go. For now, I'm just going to mention that eagles are Zeus's totemic creature. So keep that in mind as we go. Then we have another full page of them arriving at an Air Force base. We take special note of the dove and the owl that are watching. Doves are the totemic creatures of Aphrodite, and owls are Athena's totemic creatures. You may be noticing a theme. Then we have another full page of Diana not getting shot. And it seems really weird to me that we skipped over her throwing the guard to the ground. Not because he did something wrong and he deserves to be thrown to the ground, but because we see him reaching for her. We have birds and people yelling and freaking out, and the next thing that we see, he's on the ground and she's blocking these other potential gunshots. And I'm just like, again, why would we skip the It's not a lot of action. Okay, that is not... Wonder Woman throwing some random Air Force guard to the ground is not a lot of action. But it could externalize her fish out of water situation in man's world. And remember I mentioned superheroes kind of need action-y things to do to demonstrate their internal conflict, and it just seems weird that this is a place that they would choose to skip over what little action they had. This is where I get pretty snarky. So we have another full page series of panels, but not very many panels. And most of the panels dedicated to this are Diana not understanding other people. They're failing to communicate. And that whole trust me gag with Steve feels like something out of a romantic comedy. And it might be interesting on its own merit, except Diana says, trust me. And Steve responds with, I do. But she does not understand him. Like, parrots also repeat things they hear. We don't assume that they're having a conversation with us. And so it seems too cute and not clever enough to stand up, because Diana does not understand what trust me means when she says it. And for that, and another scene we're going to see later to have the weight that I think it wants to have, she should understand those words. Maybe we could have spent some time learning that when he was crying on her shoulder an issue or two ago, right? On the next page, we have some discoveries. Steve is in great health, and nobody can believe that Amazon stuff is so boss. We spend a lot of real estate on some things that we could have gotten across in much shorter periods of time. Now, I do think Steve's appendix being grown back is a nice touch, and it does give us something of an idea of that either magic or hyper-technological healing apparatus that the Amazons were using on him. And it reminds me a little bit of the purple ray that I mentioned being a Wonder Woman staple since the very first story of her. And that this purple ray is an Amazon invention, sometimes an invention of Diana herself, that just puts you back to the way you ought to be. So I do think it's kind of clever that Steve's appendix has grown back. But I have some questions about some other stuff. When they say they've never seen an edge like this on one of her swords, I know that we are nodding towards that supposed advanced technology of the Amazons, but I just don't see how. Steve says advanced technology, but very simple living. Okay? That is interesting. Because another part of the Discord chat was talking about the unintended consequences of scientific advances and how the emphasis on simple living could belie the technology we would expect to a certain degree. But kind of like the romantic relationships or friendship relationships, I would have liked to have seen more of this on the page. I would have liked to have seen more of their high technology applications on Themyscira. I don't want to turn Wonder Woman into a science fiction hero necessarily, but I would have liked to have seen more of that. And if I'm honest, I kind of also want to turn Wonder Woman into a science fiction hero, but that might just be me. On the next couple of pages, Diana makes friends easily, and everyone remains baffled by Amazon technology. But they put her in a cell, because of course they do. And I know that we're doing a thing with Man's World here, but it stretches my credulity a little bit. You have trusted intel telling you that she's some kind of an ambassador from an advanced civilization, and your choice is to put her into something that looks like an Old West sheriff's jail cell. Really? This is how we're going to deal with our first interaction with this new society? Sure, put a guard on her. Sure, put her in some kind of secure facility, but make it a secure facility that is friendly or comfortable. Don't put her in Silver Dollar City's jail cell. It's a weird choice. So here we are, 2 1/3 issues in, and we have spent all of this time following Steve around. We just now find out sort of what his failed mission was, or at least we understand that it involves the Seer Group. That name gets dropped. We don't have any idea what that means. We have nothing to hang that on to, but at least we know the mission involved Seer. And then Diana is sad, but the dove is back. That's like a whole couple of panels. When we have a lot of questions about Amazon technology and weaponry. When we have a lot of questions about Amazon romance. And actually, as far as being stuck in a cell, I think showing that Diana is saddened by this rather than angry, I think that's a good move. But we just take so long doing it. Especially when you consider that we're going to see Steve sitting in a room alone with that dove tapping on the window to get debriefed some more. Holy cow, this is a lot of debriefing for us to have to sit through. We do, however, finally meet Etta Candy, and much to my chagrin, I don't love her. I mean, she's fine, but she seems very typical. Very typical as a Air Force intelligence officer, I mean. She is very much reacting to this news, to this information about Themyscira and the Amazons with mistrust and fear. And if she were the Etta that I wanted her to be, I feel like she would be less scared and more interested and possibly invested in an all-woman society. I don't necessarily need her to be a lesbian or bisexual. I don't necessarily need her to have that kind of interest. But I would like to see a woman that we can kind of read between the lines and know that if she's reached a high enough rank in the Air Force, has had to fight and claw and work against inherent sexism and misogyny in order to reach that place. And I would just be really interested to see an Etta Candy that hears all-woman society and then follows that up with, you say? And be interested in that as a concept. Maybe that's just me. Please let me know what you think in the chat. So then we have some more debriefing. We also have some sad stuff about Nick that, I mean, I'm going to be honest with you guys, I super don't care about. Once again, Steve mentions the technology. I'm with Kate. Where the hell was it? We didn't get to see it. What does this mean? I know I'm harping on that, but I don't know what else to say. We go back to visiting Diana in her Old West jail cell, where there is yet another person failing to understand her language. She and Etta seem to bond over words that Diana still does not understand the meaning of. And I know that's a callback. I know that's a callback to the thing with Steve, but again, she doesn't understand what the words mean. So there's no actual connection going on here, and it just kind of really puts me off. I don't know. I will tell you a fun little Easter egg. The man doing the translating, or trying to do this translating, is Dr. Perez. He's named by Etta, and the way he's drawn bears a striking resemblance to George Perez, a comic book writer and artist, and one of the previous architects of one of Diana's origins. So that's kind of fun. Kate finds it bizarre that Etta is so dumbfounded by a tall lady. Okay, for real. Because what does she say? She's 6'2"? I think, if I remember right, Etta says that Diana is 6'2". First of all, that is not big enough for the clothes that they loaned to Steve to be too big for him, which we specifically mentioned in the last one. Secondly, I'm 6'1", and I don't tower over other human beings. Like, I'm tall, but I don't tower over them. Especially my wife, who is 5'11". In her stocking feet, as Etta says. My wife is 5'11". And she is a tall woman, but she doesn't get stared at on the street for being nearly 6 feet tall, and I don't feel like 3 more inches on her would do it. And the reason I don't feel that way is because in certain shoes, she's 3 inches taller, which makes her taller than me. And in certain shoes, I stay this height. And we've never got... It's not like cars come screeching to a halt as they notice that there's a woman cracking 6 feet. On the next page, we are introduced to Dr. Barbara Ann Minerva. And doesn't she sound like Indiana Jones? There's a moment when I read this the first time that I kind of felt like I would rather be reading her comic than this one. And again, I didn't hate this book, but I just wasn't enthralled. And the idea that you could have this globe-trotting Indiana Jones-style woman who gets 1-ton rocks falling on her leg and takes it in stride, if you'll pardon the pun, is pretty fantastic. And I was kind of like, can I just go read Dr. Minerva, Obtainer of Rare Antiquities? When we come back to the story at hand, Diana is still sad. Steve is sad. Nick's wife is sad. Nick's daughter is sad. But Athena is pissed. I'm assuming. Owls always look really angry to me. So I'm just assuming Athena's annoyed. The mission comes up again in the conversation between Steve and Nick's wife. And it just doesn't have any weight. I just wish we'd heard more about it in the first couple issues. Go out and make sure that their deaths aren't meaningless. Get the mission done. And I'm like, what is the mission? What did they even die doing? Where were they flying? I wish we knew. Right? I just really wish we knew. As Diana is sitting in her cell, definitely losing hope and possibly losing her faith, the patrons all appear. Now, I've been a mythology nerd since I was a little kid. I mean, I think it's tied into the superhero fascination, but I mean, I was breeding Greek and Roman and Norse mythologies when I was very young. So it's either the superhero tie-in, or I was fascinated by the Dungeons and Dragons Deities and Demigods book. Somewhere between that mix of stuff in my head, I started reading mythology really early. And so I recognized most of these right off. I don't know about you guys. Please tell me what you think in the comments. But for your purposes, Hera, Queen of the Gods, is associated with a peacock. Artemis is associated with the stag. Hephaestus is associated with a mouse. And that one I actually had to look up. It was familiar, but I couldn't quite remember, and I had to go look it up. The tortoise is a bit of a question mark to me. Aphrodite is sometimes equated with a tortoise, but we already have her there as the dove, because again, the dove and the owl also show up here. And I thought maybe it was Apollo, because the first lyre, the harp instrument that they invented in Greece, according to the story, Apollo made that first one from a turtle shell. So maybe that's supposed to be associated with Apollo? I couldn't figure it out. If you guys know, let me know. Susie asks, doesn't Diana say in a panel who the mouse and tortoise are? Well, I'm going to go look right now. Okay, so she mentions gray-eyed Athena, which is the owl, and she mentions Hera, that's the peacock, and Artemis the stag. Oh, he wore a tortoise! It's right there! I must have been super bored by the time I was reading this page, because that did not dial in on me at all. Wow! Okay, I'm sorry, Kate. But the best part of this page for me is that Diana's look of wonder is so delightful. She knows exactly who this is, and they came to her in her deepest, darkest moment and just brought the light in with them. And that is so cool. And it's the kind of moment that I really appreciate from Diana, because I mentioned I like the fairy tale princess stuff, and that this is kind of like the animal companions that show up in Disney type things, right? Where there are always a group of mice that are helping out, or a horse that's too smart for its own good, or a chameleon in the case of Tangled. There's all these animal companions, and here she gets some that are actual gods, and she knows that that's what's happening, and her face just lights up. Like, I can imagine just a little girl level of excitement there. Christmas morning kind of stuff. And I really appreciated that. It's probably my favorite panel in the whole comic book. We get a little more of Dr. Minerva, who remains awesome, but we're wasting real estate here. She's dismissive of Steve. Great. So say we all, right? And she's brilliant. And it's important that we know she's brilliant. But the Air Force flew her in specifically to talk to Diana, and we're going to get opportunities for her to show off her brilliance in other ways. It's fine. Whatever. But man, do we waste a lot of real estate on this. I do, however, really love how she immediately groks Amazonian. I mean, straight through the door. She may need to think about it a little bit. She may need to translate in her head because you see that the font changes a little bit in her words, like she's stumbling over the pronunciation, but she immediately dials into the Amazonian. And I really appreciated that someone in the room brought up the fact that Superman exists, because that raises one of my biggest pet peeves about skeptics in superhero universes. If any of you watch the Flash TV show, there is a moment early on where they just stop disbelieving that impossible things can happen. And they just start trying to approach problems as though reality barely has a hold anymore. And as silly as that is, on one hand, I'm like, nah, that's really how superhero universes work. And it doesn't work for me when somebody shows up and is like, well, but that's not how, unless it's Joe. But everyone else who shows up saying, well, but that's not really how reality works. Whatever. The Flash exists. Everything has changed, right? Now, the point of these gods visiting were to give Diana's gifts, and we will return to the gifts as they manifest, but I really like this. I like this because it keeps Amazons exceptional while also explaining why Diana is exceptional even among Amazons. I mean, I know she wasn't when she was competing, but she is now. She is now to the Amazons what the Amazons would be to a regular woman, and I think that's pretty cool. Describing them as gifts instead of powers also feels like a very fairy tale thing. When the three fairies come to Aurora's birth and give her gifts, they don't give her powers. I mean, I know it's beauty, and I forget what they are, honestly, but they give her gifts. Like I said, it just feels more like a fairy tale, which turns back into that whole princesses and animal companions thing. So it never stops being Wonder Woman. These are the gods of myth that have shown up to give her abilities far above those of mortal women. But at the same time, they're also fairy tale princess animal companions that are gifting things to her, which I think was pretty great. Now, I have a question in my notes where I say, did they include covers in the collection? And now I see that they did, because we are now going to transition into the next issue. When they had covers in the collection, did they have the one that said, before Cheetah, there was Dr. Barbara and Minerva? Was that one in your collections? So thanks to my lovely patrons, I've realized that in the collection of this story, the Barbara and Minerva digression comes at the end of the trade. It's not put in the place that it was in the story that it was when they were published on a monthly basis. And that makes a certain amount of sense, because it would make even less sense coming at the end of the year one story with no other context in the regular monthly book. But I can definitely understand why they did it that way in the collection, but it leads me to a place where I asked you to do the wrong homework, and I'm very sorry. So, saying that, I will recommend that you read the story about Barbara Ann. It's probably, I hate to say this, it's probably on its own merits the most interesting issue of the whole thing, at least for me. It has a very definite beginning, middle, and end. It has its own story question. The answer to the story question is no when you get to the end. It stands alone as a single satisfying issue, as long as you don't find no's to your story question as inherently unsatisfying. So the reason I ask is because we are going to have to talk about Cheetah now, thanks to this. Wonder Woman does not have an extensive or really fantastic rogues gallery. If you've never heard that term, that is kind of a catch-all for someone's villains. This superhero has all of these villains, and so they are that superhero's rogues gallery. This is not an indictment of her character. If we're honest, only 3 superheroes have great rogues galleries, and some great superheroes have really, really crap ones. Cheetah is one of Wonder Woman's biggest villains and has been since the Golden Age, although she's taken a few different names and forms and faces. She started out as a multiple personality disorder socialite in a cat outfit, but eventually became a mystical werecat empowered by gods. I really like the mystical werecat empowered by a god because it makes her an opposite number villain to Wonder Woman. And what I mean by that is, it makes her a villain that is like Wonder Woman, but for one little twist. right? So instead of being given gifts that make Diana transcendent, Barbara Ann is given a gift that makes her monstrous. So is it really a gift? Maybe it's a curse. So all of that information seems to tie into that resting on previous continuity problem that we discussed in this arc as far as Steve is concerned. How does our brief meeting with Dr. Minerva at the end of that last issue justify an entire sixth of the story being dedicated to her? And the answer is, it doesn't. The only way that that makes sense is if we know she's going to eventually be Cheetah. When we meet Barbara Ann, she is rich, she's sheltered, she's lonely. Her mother is recently deceased and her father is distant and cold, and what little joy she has, her father takes away. He takes away her book of mythology for children and throws it in the fire right in front of her. She's told fantasy is over and it's time to grow up. Flash forward, and I could not admire her response to her father's words more. She has taken her dedication to mythology and has turned it into her grown-up career. I'm really fascinated at this point to discover that her obsession with the Amazons goes deep. It's almost lifelong, and it's definitely for her professional life. What does this mean to her character? And can you guys think what meeting Diana must have meant to her? Can you imagine? You think Diana's face lit up when she met the gods? Meeting proof that her own theories about the Amazons might be true, could possibly be true, had to have been absolutely a transcendent moment for Barbara Ann. And then, since we now know, whether you knew when you were reading the book or not, now you know she becomes Cheetah, what could drive this woman, this driven, brilliant woman, to become a murderous villain? I'm also going to say that I really like her response of what you call myth, I call propaganda. This absolutely happened in ancient mythology, and the Amazons are a great example of this. Because Greek men, patriarchal societies, turned empowered women into monsters. And I feel like the comparison with Count Dracula is particularly apt. Because if you go back to the original mythology, as best we can, Greek men obviously fantasized about Amazons because the Amazons fall when Hercules seduces Hippolyta and steals her girdle. He was able to convince her to take off her most intimate garment, which means, they got together, they had sex, okay? And the idea that that's how the Amazons fall is through Hercules, who is their perfect form of masculinity. This is how this imperfect version of femininity falls, is through the perfect version of Greek masculinity. I'm going to say on record, that feels like they were sexually attracted to some of their monsters. After a long cultural road, we have turned Dracula, and by extension, most vampires, into sex monsters. Just like the Amazons kind of were for Greeks. So that is absolutely an apt comparison as far as I'm concerned. Moving on, Barbara Ann is mysteriously awoken by a massive lightning bolt and a white mouse. Is that coincidence or divine intervention? Is that Zeus and Hephaestus? Spoiler warning, it almost certainly is. We'll see as we go, but right now, I feel like that ambiguity is kind of interesting to the way her story is playing out. Barbara Ann is a woman of ambition, and she goes out because she thinks that a discovery is being snaked out from under her. Instead, she discovers confirmation of her Amazon theories, and also discovers that they had previous queens. Between you and me, that's an interesting world-building question for the Amazons, right? Was this before the island and immortality? If so, how long? How many other queens were there? What was going on with the Amazons before they became immortal and went to Themyscira? However, after this, a cave-in robs her of the discovery, and that, to me, feels like Greek god intervention. They aren't usually good folks. They don't usually take good care of their worshippers, by and large. So the fact that she's let in and discovers the most amazing thing she's ever seen in her whole life, and then has it immediately taken from her by what an insurance company would assuredly call an act of God, that actually seems even more on the label than the lightning and the mouse. Barbara Ann's colleague, Dr. Martins, values safety over Barbara Ann's obsession. He's probably not wrong, but I really feel for her here. Like, I can feel the weight of her losing access to this discovery. But she still has some proof. She took pictures. She also got enough of a look at the language to realize that it's Greco-Slavic with an Afro-Asiatic influence. And I'm going to say to you right now, I am not a linguist, but that sounds like word salad. So I would love to know more. If any of you are linguists, if any of you know linguists, run that sentence past them and let me know if that's nonsense or if that's actually a thing. What it suggests to us in terms of the story is that the Amazons traveled the world and settled in multiple places for long enough to have their language influenced before they got to Themyscira. Again, I'm not a linguist, so I don't know how long it takes for local languages to permeate a society. But if you're talking about a society of all women warriors, they're not going to be very well received in a lot of very patriarchal areas that they traveled to. And I wonder how much interaction they had with their surrounding civilizations. So if they didn't have very much, which seems probable, how long did they have to live in these areas to have those languages impact them? I'm very curious about that. Could be a really long time, right? At any rate, Dr. Martins doesn't buy it. Is he right, or is he jealous of Barbara Ann? That's a question that you guys can ponder. I'm curious what you think. For me, I'm going to go with jealous. Men in academia must have been terrified of a woman as brilliant as Barbara Ann Minerva. He actually lists some of her incredible accomplishments, and I feel like the fact he can do that off the tip of his tongue probably means that they're keeping him up at night. So I'm going to go with he's jealous of her. So Hippolyta's the 10th queen of the Amazons, but this was the 12th queen? I'm really confused how this works. So did the Amazons birth sort of lesser Amazonian civilizations before they moved on? Or I may be overthinking it. But if Hippolyta's the 10th queen, and Barbara Ann finds the 12th queen, and then starts counting backwards. Okay, yeah, it says, the resting of Lysippe, the 12th queen of the Amazons. I'm not sure how to jive that with Hippolyta, immortal 10th queen of the Amazons. Did somebody just drop the ball on a detail? I'm not sure. Let me know if you guys have theories. I'm very interested. I gotta tell you, I feel like we're more invested in the Amazon world building than the comic book is. Later, Victor, one of the guys who worked at the dig, finds Barbara Ann drunk and steals her phone. While Barbara Ann is complaining to Martins about Victor, and Martins is condescending to her, she has one of those flashes of brilliance that honestly only happen in fiction. But she knows where the Amazons went. And now we're on a worldwide tour, and it makes me wish for a map and a line drawn across it like Indiana Jones, because that's the headspace Barbara Ann Minerva puts me into. Towards the end of her worldwide tour, we are introduced to the evil tree symbol for a terrorist group called Seer. She doesn't know that they're called Seer, but we will eventually know. Now I'm going to ask you, wouldn't seeing this thread come together with all the other threads be more interesting if they laid it out back in the first two issues? If we had been hearing about Seer from Steve's point of view, and then we see maybe a scene where Diana is with that evil tree, and then later we have Steve being briefed on the mission and they show him this tree and saying, this is the symbol of Seer, we would start to understand how Steve and Diana's destinies are intertwined at that point. That would have been really interesting. And unfortunately, we're just getting it all piecemeal right now. At this point, Barbara Ann is approached by an old woman and a young girl. And this old woman seems to know things. Looking at this, I want to make this evocative of the Fates. But it can't be them. There were 3 Fates, and they were typically all depicted as crones. Those of you who are used to the Fates being crone, mother, and maiden, that's Norse, not Greek. Greek Fates are just old ladies. This particular crone warns Barbara Ann about the twists and turns of her life, and then calls her kitten. And knowing that she's going to turn into a mystical werecat being, I gotta tell you, I really like that touch. That really entertains me. While she's resting, Barbara Ann figures out the riddle given to her by the crone. She's going the wrong direction on this Amazon trek. It's at that point that the young girl that was traveling with the crone is revealed to be Athena, but I'm still not sure who the old lady is. She's not blind anymore, but blue eyes aren't enough of a clue for me. Maybe I'm missing something. I think Hera is probably a good guess, although Hera is not typically, none of the Olympians are really depicted as aged in that way. So I don't know. I'm still not sure who she is, but obviously the young girl is Athena because she turns into an owl. Barbara Ann travels to the Black Sea and to an island that should not be there. Is this Themyscira? Well, the patrons are on Barbara Ann's side, and according to the Amazons, you can't find Themyscira unless the patrons allow it. So I think it could be Themyscira. But where are the Amazons? I don't know. But there is the gate, or the tree that we will learn is the gate when it attacks Diana. We don't know what that means, but there's the evil tree on an island apparently devoid of life that she couldn't have found without the help of Greek gods. So if Barbara Ann is allowed to find Themyscira, and we know from Diana's time on the island that the tree is emblematic of the gate, and that the gate is on Themyscira, and Barbara Ann finds the gate, but no Amazons, what does this mean? Is this Themyscira? What ominous meaning is there in the tree or the gate? Barbara Ann, because she's left wondering after all of this travel and all of this discovering things, I feel like she is now defeated, and she goes back to a life of more or less normal academia until we pick up her story again when she's brought in to help translate Diana's language. My number one story concern is that not enough happens in any of these 6 issues. We're only through 4 of them. Actually, considering how they put them together in the trade, we're only through 3 of 5. But no matter how you slice it, I don't feel like enough is actually happening, and it's hard for me to stay tied in. When we were so focused on Diana and her life on Themyscira in the first 2 issues, even when Steve knocked that sandcastle down, we got to see how the Amazons and Diana reacted to that. And so I was still tied into her story, and I found that really interesting. Now we get to this place, and it feels like we're more interested in Steve and Barbara Ann, and while Barbara Ann's individual issue really works, her insertion into Diana's story does not work super well, at least in terms of things happening. Am I wrong? Many of my patrons are very new to superhero comics in general and Wonder Woman in particular, but they are story nerds. If nothing else, my patrons are story nerds. And so tell me what you guys think. Does it hold together as interesting, cohesive chapters in the story? Another big question / concern I have. Should some of these threads, like Seer and the Tree Gate, have been woven into the first 2 issues? My answer is yes. You may disagree, and I want you to disagree with me, but to kind of bolster my yes, I want you to imagine going back in time. Imagine we had set it up so that Ares is somehow the focus of the Amazon's duty, and we'd seen Diana learning about that. And if we have to do that juxtaposition thing between her and Steve, while she's learning that Ares is the focus of Amazon duty, Steve is learning about Seer. He's learning about this terrorist organization that he has to go on a very important mission for. And then we see Diana attacked at the tree. And then later we see Steve briefed on the symbol for Seer, and it's the tree that we saw involved in Diana's attack. Ooh, what is happening? Are these things tied together? And then, assuming that they put the chapters in the order that I have them, then we see Barbara Ann's work and what she discovers, including that symbol, including knowing that the Amazons traveled around and were world globetrotters. Suddenly, we have a better understanding of, if not the whole story, at least how these characters are all intertwined inside of it. Kate says, I think the creative team was afraid to tackle the big mythology and they're nibbling around the edges too much. I mentioned in the first session that Rebirth is the second Wonder Woman relaunch / origin in a very short amount of time. The previous one that we will eventually talk about that happened under the New 52 was very, very heavily invested in Greek mythology. And so you may have a point that the creative team chose to nibble around the edges of that mythology rather than take it head on, because that's what the previous creative team had just got done doing. I say just got done. There's a couple of years in there, but that was a huge selling point of the New 52 relaunch, is that Wonder Woman was going to become very much a warrior first and foremost, and that the things that she declared war on were the monsters of mythology, usually Greek mythology, and including some goddesses. So you may be onto something there. And I can sympathize with the creators who have to look back at the thing that just got done while looking forward to the thing that they're trying to do and try and figure out how to both be compelling to the new reader that might not be familiar with the previous one. And now I'm realizing that I just explained a whole bunch of stuff when you meant the character mythology of Wonder Woman. I actually think that my answer for that my answer for nibbling around the edges of Greek mythology stands. it does seem like they're just not taking whole bites of the stuff that would make us really interested, right? And again, for a lot of you listening to this, you only have the movie to compare it to. And how much, I hate to say how much better, because all these things, your mileage may vary. But I feel that at a more or less subjective how stories are put together level, I just feel like the movie made so many more economical choices to bring Diana and the Amazons and their duty into direct headlong crash with Steve's life. And I think they could have done that here with the Seer terrorist group and just didn't. And along the way, maybe we would have gotten to know a little bit more about the Amazons, and maybe we would have gotten to know a little bit more about Steve in a way that made us care. Here is a fascinating conversation, especially considering you guys didn't read it this way. I would like you, as a thought experiment, to skip to the end, read the Barbara Ann issue, and then imagine that had come into play where I read it. And I want to know what you guys think. Would that digression have worked if you didn't know who she was? Now you know who Cheetah is. You know why we need to be invested in Barbara Ann Minerva. But imagine that the last thing you saw was that she's brilliant and apparently speaks Amazonian, and then you close that and you open the next book and it's 25 pages of her backstory. Would that have worked? Would you have felt that it was worth it? Are you interested in her? And since I told you about Cheetah now, do you feel like that would make you curious about their friendship and how it could devolve into enmity? I mean, I'll admit, I'm interested. Also, admittedly, not sure this was the way to do it. Susie says, I would have appreciated the story about Barbara Ann up front. It's called an interlude, after all. Those come in the middle of a story, not at the end. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, like I said, it makes a certain amount of sense to me for them to move it to the end of the trade. But at the same time, you get to the end of the Wonder Woman origin story, and then you turn the page, and there's this, Barbara Ann story in the collection, and it makes me go, what does a new reader think about that? I just finished the Wonder Woman story. What's this? I mean, it's weird. And that brings us to the end of session number 2. I hope you'll join us next time for session number 3, where we look at the last 2 chapters in Wonder Woman Rebirth Year 1. Thank you all for joining me, and we'll see you next time in Superhero University. Superhero University is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions.